Hello, welcome to Failing with Grace, Choosing Resiliency. My name is Tamara Nash. I have the great joy of serving as the ABA YLD Secretary for the 21-22 bar year. And I today get to be your moderator. I'm so delighted that you all are here with us. Today, we're having a very exciting and a very important conversation. In the legal profession and in law school, we very much promote perfection, we promote winners, and we criticize losers. As a result, we internalize a fear of failure. And today, we are going to challenge you to reframe your concept of failure. This program will give you practical tools and relevant perspectives to silence your critical inner voice and empower you to embrace the freedom in failure. Joining me today for this very important conversation are three very dynamic and, might I add, cool individuals who are going to tackle this conversation from both the academic and practical perspective. So today, I would like to welcome our faculty, and I will go in order and introduce them to you all. First, Natasha Kazanov. Natasha is a neuropsychologist, a psychotherapist, and creator of the SMART coaching program. She is also an associate clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. Next, we have Dr. Tiffany Haynes. Tiffany is a clinical psychologist with expertise in mental health services research, intervention development, and community-based research. She is also an associate professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, Faye W. Bozeman College of Public Health, and the co-director of the Health Promotion and Prevention Research Doctoral Program. And last but certainly not least is my friend David Morrow. Dave serves as the co-founder and chief operating officer and inaugural director for the Greenbelt Group. And additionally, Dave has a very extensive background in community and bar services. Most notably, Dave served as the inaugural chair of the ABA YLD Men of Color program, project, which launched in 2018 and 2019. Of course, these are very abbreviated biographies for our very esteemed faculty. I encourage you to go onto the website to check out their more extensive bios, but to afford more time to this very important conversation, we're going to dive right in. So with that, I'd like to welcome our faculty, Tiffany, Natasha, Dave. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to get the next 60 minutes with you all. Before we dive in, I want to let our audience know these three have graciously accepted the opportunity, maybe the challenge, to take your questions at the end. So feel free to put those in the chat function throughout the program. So without further ado, let's get into it. So let's set the stage here. This program is about challenging the traditional fear of failure. And before we get into challenging that fear, why should our audience stick around here? What is your best argument here for why they should embrace fear? Why is failure good, rather said. So Natasha, you're first in my Zoom box, actually. So I'm going to kick it to you. What's your best argument here?
All right, so let me start out by saying I think it's a really great topic. Whoever chose it, I thank you, Tamara, thank you, because I think that we all can learn from one another, even those who seem to be like professionals and teach other people. Failure is something that we'll have, and I'm sure that all people who are now listening to us also want to be successful. And then we are talking about failure because this is something that, in my opinion, is absolutely true. There is no success without failure. I failed plenty, and all the people I know who are really successful in the grand scheme of things would acknowledge that they failed. So then when we say, choose resilience, when you fail, well, easier said than done. So I hope that today all of us will share our experiences of how we can choose courage over fear. This is what resilience is about. And, Einstein, who knew the great success but also some failures, said that failure is success in progress. So this is my best argument.
I love that. That's our quote to live by for the day. Awesome. Dave, I'll kick it over to you. How about you? What's your best case argument here?
It's a good learning lesson. I think that the most that I've learned about my own life and about my career, I've learned from failures and mistakes I made along the way, and that has really kind of shaped my understanding of what I want to do long term for my life, for my family's life. And it was because I, had to fall down a few times. Doesn't dismiss the fact that it hurts and it sucks when you fall down, but it is a great lesson to learn. And I tend to remember the failures more, not because of they were awful, but because of what I learned in the process.
That's fantastic. And Tiffany, you get to bring us home as our anchor here. How about you?
So Natasha started off with quoting Einstein. I'm going to quote Chance the Rapper, who in one of the lines of his song said, "I turned all my L's into lessons." And so failures become lessons, and we need those to get to the place that we want to be. But oftentimes we look at failure as meaning something about us, so we internalize it and we live in that shame. So why do you need to stick around today? Because we're going to talk about the practical tips for us to see failure as an event that happens versus a characteristic of ourselves, so we can learn the lessons and let go of the shame.
I love that. That's amazing. And we have so many law students in the audience today, which turning that conversation on its head is so important to do early and to take that tool with you throughout your career. So I love that that's what you're bringing to the table here today. So awesome. All right, let's jump in. So we've made our business case. We've set the table here. And we've talked about why fear can be good, why we need to embrace it. Let's talk a little bit about why we even fear failure to begin with, how we got here. So do you want to start us out with this, Natasha? Why do we do this? Why do we fear failure? What is going on with our brain? Where does this come from?
Well, I call myself a recovering neuroscientist, and I never leave home without this. It's my business card. So, thinking about why we are so fearful of failure, we need to understand that our brain basically stopped developing about 40,000 years ago. Just think for a moment what life was like 40,000 years ago. We lived in small bands in caves, and life was dangerous. So it is important to remember that your brain is the danger detecting machine. And when there is no danger, we make it up. And there are networks in our brain that do that. Like there is a lot of research about default mode network. So what happened when people were courageous living in the bands, they just didn't make it. They received the Darwin Award. They were eaten by the, saber-toothed tiger or bitten by the snake. So evolution wants us to be, fearful. So our brain is amazing, but it is also bugging. It is buggy because all the things that make us fear, are helping us under the circumstances that were valid when we lived in the caves, but not now. There are different types of stressors, so that's why we need to understand the adaptive and maladaptive function of fear.
So, in taking that into consideration with the role that fear plays and maybe anxiety plays, as we move forward and walk through life, how do we teach our brain to bend rather than break, as words that maybe you would use? In other words, to adapt to stress and to teach ourselves to develop confidence to walk through life. And I'll shoot that to you, Natasha. Sorry, I didn't say who I was talking to there.
Well, one of the things that is the starting place is to acknowledge that we have fear, anxiety, worry. Every time when we do something that is important to us, they will absolutely show up. So one of the things that I always teach, my kid, myself, and then my clients to do is just acknowledge, yeah, I am fearful now. And the reason that we have anxiety, worry, fear is because we do things that are important to us. I have a slide there that is called the most important thing is to remember what the most important thing is. Maybe we can bring it up so that we can use the visual. So, we are not logical, we are biological. That means that when we are in the state of fear, we are not focused on how to be smart, how to put a good oral argument. Our brain goes into survival mode. See the red brain? So that means that until we reclaim our ability to focus and concentrate and think straight, we cannot really be successful. That's why learning how to not break, and this is what we call resilience. Resilience is the bounce back factor. That is something that we are not born with. We need to learn, and it is learnable and teachable. So when we are in the fight or flight response, we are not really adept at dealing with the stressors the way they are now. When we are in the life is good, soothe response, parasympathetic arousal, then we can be at our best.
So something you said really resonated with me about reclaiming that. And I think about, I'll be in a situation at work and I instantly am in that panic mode and I kind of space everything out. And, that's the only thing that I think of. So I want to know, and maybe Tiffany, you can speak to this too. What are some practical tools we can equip our audience with to really pull themselves back in to reclaim that mindset? Do you have any in the here and now tips, tools, tricks that you can equip our audience with to help bring them back and help reclaim their mindset, kind of to what you were talking a little bit about just previously? I'll start with you, Natasha, and Tiffany, if you have anything to weigh in too, I'd love to hear from you.
So one of the things that I learned very early in I think it was in grad school, the saying by Fritz Perls, who was this famous psychologist, and he said, get out of your mind, get into your senses. Get out of your mind, get into your senses. So we have what I call the curse of an overeducated Westerner. A lot of times we overthink things and we come up with ideas that are not really helpful. So one of the grounding things to do is when I'm anxious, when I cannot come up with the right argument, when I'm testifying in courts, I sometimes testify in murder cases, and you know how it is. I don't need to tell you, it's scary when you're an expert in a murder case. So, and I feel anxiety rising in me, I will just settle my gaze on something that I can see, something beautiful, maybe a piece of art. And then I will touch myself, to stimulate my brain in different areas. So what we are doing here, we are stimulating the sensory areas of the brain. And then, of course, breathing. The 4-4-4 breathing is something that I would always do. 4 in, then hold 4, and then out 4. So there are many, many simple tricks and tools. When I'm angry, I will just open my hands and relax the tongue on the floor of my mouth, so that I won't be impeached because I get really angry at the unfair questions that are asked of me. So there are simple things, but it is the body and the movement, the breathing, not the thinking. But when we say don't be anxious, we make it worse for ourselves. So the first step is awareness and normalizing it for yourself. Yeah, you're doing something that is important.
That's fabulous. I'll remember that next time I'm in trial. Those are great, great tidbits. Thank you. Tiffany, you certainly don't have to, but would love to hear any insight you have on practical tips and tricks here.
I think Natasha did a great job. One of my favorite ones is the deep breath. I think of like that anxiety of sometimes being your alarm on your car going off, and you have to find your keys to press that button to turn it off. Breathing, that deep breath turns that anxiety alarm off just enough for you to get out of your mind with the thinking and ground yourself. So do not underestimate. It sounds so simple, and it's like, oh, take a deep breath. And we tell that all the time when we see somebody else angry. Oh, just take a deep breath. But it really is something about breathing and controlling your breathing that helps you deal with anxiety. I personally, Natasha talked about your senses. I sometimes when I'm feeling very anxious in a moment, I may use aromatherapy. So I may have some scents in my office that I go to that help me calm down. If I'm doing something that raises a lot of anxiety, I may put on just a little bit of those oils on my hands so I can kind of do a little whiff every once in a while so I can smell that. And I love to use music. So I am going to be that person that's going to have that theme song to get me hyped, that theme song to calm me down, whatever I need. And musically, it helps me deal with the anxiety. So figure out what works for you and then have those things like in a little bag in the back of your head, in your briefcase, wherever you need it, that you can go to in those moments where you're feeling really anxious.
I, much like you, Tiffany, had my same go-to final song. That was People Knew to Leave Me Alone. I was in my corner doing my hype up, and that was my thing. So I didn't know that's what I was doing or that was an actual concept, but so I'm glad you've confirmed that I was doing something there. So Dave, I'd like to turn to you. We have a lot of law students in our audience, and a lot of really new lawyers. As Tiffany and Natasha have kind of walked through some of these grounding techniques and things that they encourage folks to do. As you've walked through your career and looking into some of your time as a law student, are there any things that worked for you well that you'd like to share with our audience that you've been able to lean into and that have helped ground you in moments of fear or anxiety?
Yeah, and I want to speak a little bit to what Natasha was saying earlier. I think that for law students and for lawyers in general, we're trained to be risk averse. We're trained to do the most careful way to revise our clients, do all the things to cross our T's and dot our I's. And so we're more prone, I think, to issues of anxiety and in encountering those. And so I think it was a recognition for me to realize like, hey, I've been trained one way, I've been molded in one way, I need to adapt a little bit, I need to evolve my own self for my own benefit, for my own health, my own mental health. And I think that's, it's not talked about in law school, but I think really our training contributes to a lot of this. As to what I do, I think over the years that's evolved, right? In the beginning, yes, deep breaths were helpful. And then sometimes they weren't helpful enough for me. I think it had to figure out what was going to work for me long term. And in the moment, sometimes I can't figure out what's going to, give me some peace of mind. And so it's really that follow-up for me that I think has been the most helpful now as I walk through life is what do I do after those moments of intense anxiety? It's a combination. I just had a little boy, he's 11 months old, and I love being around my family. Simple things like that give me peace of mind and ground me into what's really important. Because there's this client, that client. I had a crazy call this morning, and I have to remind myself, hey, what matters, what's in my control. At the end of the day, I can control how I react to people, I can control how I react to a situation. There's a lot that's not in my control, and so I tend to focus on those things that are in my control, and then ground myself in a space in which provides me happiness. And so for Tiffany, you mentioned music. That's definitely a thing for me. This might sound a little cliche, but I just love being around my wife. And so that's always gives me some joy. And so yeah, those are some of the things. I think when I was a law student, definitely music, deep breaths. I mean, I'm an avid gamer. If there are any gamers in the audience, I play a lot of video games. Even today, I still do as a 36-year-old. And so that's always been a nice distraction. Music, I play a couple instruments as well. And so, again, I think it's really particular to the individual, what gives them solace, what provides them that type of peace of mind. It could be reading, it could be music, but you have to figure that out because you'll need it. Because being a lawyer, it can be very challenging at times. We're in a service profession. We have to provide service to other people that may not be, have the right mindset at times. And so we have to be able to kind of provide that steady measured advice, and not take things at a personal level. So yeah, I just said a lot, but I kind of wanted to get it all out there.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing what has worked for you and how you've had to learn to adapt. And one thing you really touched on, I think that is so important, is what our profession has really, in an unhealthy way, embraced is perfection, and why really this conversation is kind of profound, to encourage people to relish in failure and relish in this space that can be so uncomfortable, because we, have the relationship that we do with winning and losing and perfection. So I think that's such a great point that you hit on. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to segue a little bit here. Tiffany, one of the really cool things that you do is a lot of community outreach. And in that, you encourage very honest conversations. And one thing I heard from a TED Talk you did is you noted that when we have that we should have mental health and emotional health, and see that conversation as both a window and a mirror. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. And I think this kind of connects to what Natasha was talking about earlier about the importance of acknowledging the anxiety. Sometimes we try to, close our eyes to it and pretend it's not there. But when we're talking about acknowledgement, sometimes we are looking at mental health and emotional wellness through a window, which means we can see other people. We're very good at saying, oh, that person may need some help. Oh, that person does not quite have it together right now. But when it's time for us to turn that into the mirror to see us, we're more likely to say, oh, we got some smudges on that mirror. I can't really see clearly what's going on with me. And so when we're talking about emotional wellness, I think having a mirror is important, because we need to be able to help our tribe. I talk about my community as my tribe. I have a lot of people in it. They play different roles. And so sometimes that window is helpful to be able to see when someone else is struggling and I can be helpful. But I also have to be able to turn that into a mirror where I can see myself and say, you know what? I am feeling anxious right now. You know what? I messed up and that sucked. I do not like being in a position where I did not do my best or I didn't get the desired outcome. And I feel disappointed and I feel angry and all of that. And so when we're using that mirror to see ourselves and see how we're feeling, we're better able to understand and acknowledge where we are. And then that's the first step to us being able to do the self-care things that we need to do, and to perhaps get that additional help that we need to address those issues.
Awesome. So I want to circle back to one thread of what you talked about, and that sense of the tribe, the sense of community. And I think that's really important in the legal profession for a couple reasons. And Dave, I'd like you to talk a little bit about community in the sense of the legal profession, whether it be now or in law school. How has community impacted you for good or for bad? And where do you see opportunity for us as a community to really dig in and empower folks to be vulnerable, to have these sorts of conversations, and to, kind of move the needle forward? And you've kind of talked about this a little bit, but anything you'd like to dig deeper into that notion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a generational spin going on here, because I think lawyers that are around my age and younger tend to have an open dialogue about these conversations in the profession. And there are attorneys that are, 60 plus, where this is just like, what do you mean? You just need to do your job and keep your head down. And so that could be, a hard dynamic in the workplace. And so finding your community where people can identify with your struggles is very important. I think for me, I joined the Young Lawyers Division right out of law school, and that provided a huge network and community for me that was very supportive of attorneys of different practice groups, different ethnicities and racial backgrounds, and just socioeconomic backgrounds, where it provided a nice kind of safe space in a way. I don't like using that term too much, but it really was a nice safe space for me. Additionally, being an attorney of color, the National Bar Association was very important for me to be around individuals that were having similar experiences as mine. National Bar is the largest association for Black attorneys and judges nationwide. And so, yeah, community is important. I mean, if you don't have a community, you kind of feel as if you're doing this alone, or that your experiences are just you, when really it's not just you, it's everyone, right? In similar situation. And even those that are the older attorneys I mentioned, they've been there before. They just may not remember at times, but they have been there before. And so it was important for me to recognize that, hey, you know, what I'm experiencing, my struggles early on in my practice were not just unique to me, that this is a playbook that's definitely happened before. I'll figure it out along the way. And just having that kind of confidence, like, hey, I'm not the only one. And I know that there are resources that are out there and community spaces for me to kind of be empowered and get some advice and knowledge along the way that can be part of my arsenal as I walk through my career and and just life in general. Because I think too, you gotta have to, I think lawyers, we think we know so much, right? We've got our JDs or in law school, or, you know, kind of some of the most intelligent people on the planet, right? But in the day, there has to be some humility there where you have to recognize, like, hey, I haven't done this before. You know, I don't know how this is supposed to go, and I need to figure this out. I might need some advice, right? Or, you know, I'm experiencing some large challenges in my profession, my career, that I don't know where to turn to. And so that aspect of community is just very important, because you'll need that. I mean, I don't see how you can go through your career or life without some sort of community wrapped around you, providing you that support along the way. So yeah.
Awesome. So segueing, talking in the larger external sense, Natasha, I'd like to turn to you here for a little bit. So looking at how we can look at how we can shape and influence our feelings. In your practice, you talk a lot about grit. Can you walk us through what grit stands for? What does that mean? And how we can incorporate that into our lives?
Sure. But let me just tell you that my heart is now pounding because I'm hearing so many really great ideas. And one of the things that I know as a therapist, like when I deal with people who are young lawyers, some of my clients, I work with very successful, educated people, or a lot of my clients are young physicians. There is this notion of like fitting in, keep your head down. And there is a lot of stuff that, as I call it, basically brainwashing. The most wonderful parts of us will be labeled as problematic. So courage is about the freedom to stand alone sometimes and choosing belonging, not fitting in. Because a lot of stuff is wrong in our culture, and we cannot unsee what we see now. We cannot now, we cannot pretend that we didn't see George Floyd being methodically killed. This is something that is happening now. And there is a lot of shame in people when we talk about difficult issues. So keeping our heads down doesn't really work anymore. And, the courage to not fit in is something that, again, we need the community. Tiffany and Dave both talked about how we need trusted advisors to really be courageous. It takes a village to really muster up courage. It takes more than a village, and we now live in this global village, and things are not easy. I just read the study that 95% of us have more adrenaline, cortisol in our bloodstream now with the pandemic than before. Right before the pandemic, I was asked to teach a new class at UCSF about power and privilege in medicine. I was supposed to teach it on March 10th. On March 16th, everything shut down, so I didn't teach the class. But then the lesson about power and privilege started playing out in front of our eyes. Who is more likely to get sick and die? Yeah, that's the lesson of power and privilege. And there is a lot of anger that I have about it, but my personal mantra is anger plus intelligence. When I'm angry, I cannot think straight. So yeah, we all need people who get it. We all need people who will allow us to muster up courage to sometimes stand alone, but it is not good to stand alone. So grit is something all of us need. And grit, I have a slight addiction to acronyms. I like put things into, things that are, so pillars of grit. And I consider grit to be kind of the building block of resilience, so bounce back syndrome, right? G stands for growth mindset. This is something that people talk about. So there are two types of mindset. Growth mindset, I don't know how to do it yet, but I can learn. It requires you to trust yourself, or I'm just not cut out to do it, right? This is fixed mindset. When you have fixed mindset, nothing happens. So then you will not really be resilient. Resilience is the bounce back factor, and it starts from like acknowledging I'm scared. And I trust myself. So this is the building block of confidence, when you trust yourself that you can deal with adversity, even if you are going to fail. Integrity is an interesting one, because to me, integrity is about the heart-brain alliance. We talk now about moral injury. Sometimes when you are asked to do things that are not aligned with your heart, you experience moral injury. So integrity is about like being aligned with your core values. The Latin root of the word core is heart. This is our feelings. That's how we know what is important to us. That's why it's impossible to not be angry with what's happening now in the world. It's impossible not to be anxious or fearful, but then we need to reclaim our prefrontal cortex. This is the organ of civilization, to think straight. So that's why anger plus intelligence. And then tenacity. Tenacity is, don't give up too soon. Sometimes we feel discouraged because it is too hard. So I have a lot of pep talks with people about not giving up, even though it feels like sometimes it's futile. So that's my stance on grit.
Wonderful. Those are great. And I love that concept of grit. And as you walk through those, do you have any practical tools or tips that you can share with the audience on how they can cultivate one or, many of the portions of grit as they, go out into the world and forge forward to embody grit?
Yeah. So this is one of the very hard things for me to do as a clinician, to change people's minds when they are set, in certain beliefs. So one of the things that people give up when they are busy, we have, I think, the addiction to being busy in this country. They stop doing things that will help them to be resilient, right? So one of the things that I teach my clients is there are two buckets that we draw from. One is the energy bucket and another is the tool and skill bucket. So the energy bucket is filled with things that we do like self-care. Our brain thrives on rest, good nutrition, movement, exercise, and novelty, like learning new things. But you know how hard it is for me to talk people. I work with people who are studying for their bar, for example. And they're like, well, it seems to me you're really tired. You're telling me that you're putting in 10-hour days and you don't retain information. Have you considered that if you allow yourself to rest, you will do better? You know what I hear back usually? But I cannot afford resting. There is so much I need to learn. Sometimes I have a bet with my clients and I'm like, okay, so let's experiment. You will just one day, you will allow yourself to play. You will allow yourself to do things that feed your soul. Like David, you were talking about what feeds your soul. So just one day, allow yourself to do that and see what happens in your energy bucket. I was presenting at the conference, and one of the presenters there was the psychiatrist who's very famous, and he was one of the first forensic, actually, psychiatrists. That's how I met him, Stu Brown, and he is the director of the National Institute on Play, for Play. And he wrote a book, Play, about the importance of play in the mammalian brain development. So in his presentation, he said something that absolutely made sense to me. He said, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. The opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. So now all my clients have to put play in the bucket that I have them draw, play every day. So I have people do to-do lists and not to-do lists when they study for their bar exam. 3 personal, 3 professional to-do things, because when we make the lists that are like 25 items, all attorneys are list making, all makers, all physicians are list makers. So, and we make lists of like 25 things, and then we don't get to the list and we experience it as a personal failure. So put things on the to-do list that feed your soul. 3 things that will create the resilience is about also having energy, being resourced. When you're exhausted, you are not resourced. Meditation. I'm a recovering neuroscientist. When I came to the US and discovered that people meditate, I was like, if you don't have anything else to do, meditate. But now the studies have shown that it allows us to create density in our prefrontal cortex. Basically, that's the organ of resilience, if you wish. Gratitude. There are so many studies that show, and it doesn't take a long time. Like Dave, you have a baby. So teaching the baby how to be grateful is something that requires modeling, right? So these are the things that the jury's in. It's good for our brain. Resting, eating well, and not working too hard, because after a while we become not just effective because we're exhausted.
Awesome. That's super helpful. I am very guilty of making lists. So now I will create that not to do list. So thank you for that. One thing I want to touch on is how we define success. I think that's a really important conversation to have. And Tiffany, I want to turn to you for this one. I think sometimes we get very wrapped up in letting other people define our story of success. And that, I think, is a very dangerous road, or can be a very dangerous road. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of claiming your own story? What does that mean to you, and what do you encourage our audience around having that conversation?
Definitely. But before I start, I literally have gratefulness journals and sleep masks and self-care mugs on my desk right now, because we're doing resilience kits for the community. So everything you were saying, we have in a box that we're giving out for people to build resilience. And I felt so good. I wanted to go grab the box, but we don't have time. But so you asked me the question about claiming your story and why it's so important. A lot of times and this is kind of from the beginning, we learn from those people around us. We learn from who we see, and we read other stories. So we start our life reading books, reading about other people, learning about other people. And then we start taking that, and that's how we sometimes kind of model our life. So this person has what we see as success, and we then say, okay, I'm going to do exactly what they did, exactly how they did it, and I'm going to get this picture that they've drawn. And we forget a few things. One, we forget that the picture that we see of them doesn't include all of the negative parts. So if you are a sports fan and you watch ESPN, the highlights are usually the dunks, the 3 points, the wins. Not often are they showing the person who got sacked, not for their end. They're not showing the person who had the failure. So the picture that we see doesn't include that piece. So we have to remember that, okay, we're going for a picture that may not actually be accurate. And then, because we like to tell the high points of our stories, we don't always share with everyone that, oh yeah, I took this job, but I didn't quite get the 3 that I applied for before that one. Or I got in this job and it really didn't get me closer to where I wanted to be, so I X'd that. We just talk about the end. And so claiming your story is really being able to say, I can take lesson from other people, But I have the opportunity to take those lessons and to build them together to make my life look like what I want it to look like. And to understand that success for some people, Dave was talking about people who would, just put your head down and work. In my own profession, I'm learning there's some people who are successful working 12 plus hours per day. I'm not successful at that. I need playtime. I need family time. I need all that. So now my picture of success includes taking time off to spend time with my family. It includes me doing those things because I've changed the picture. I've taken lessons, but now I'm saying, you know what, this lesson doesn't fit me anymore. I'm going to put that away, and I'm having the courage to try something new. So your story is your story. Everyone else has a story, and you have to remember that, you know what, if I'm going to be successful and be happy with what it is that I have at the end, I have to take charge of my story right now and not just model it after what I've seen.
Such an important reminder, especially in this social media world, where it's much like the highlights you talked about, where we purposely omit some of those lowlights. Dave, I want to turn to you here. One of the things I adore about you as a human is this authenticity that you just kind of ebbs from you. I'm curious, what has been your journey with that, and your journey with finding your story? Has that been something that was an easy road for you, a hard road? How has that developed over your course, your professional journey? And has there been anything that has been helpful in that journey that you would like to share with any members of our audience?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Dr. Haynes talk, I'm like, oh yeah, that was me. Literally looking at biographies when I was 25, thinking like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be like Eric Holder, who's the former Attorney General, because he did X, Y, and Z. No, not at all. I did that whole thing, trying to figure out, I'm gonna map out my life and career just like these individuals that I admire over here, not realizing, they could have gotten fired from another job, like all these other like things that are kind of left out of their bios. It cracks me up now when I read people's bios online, and sometimes it starts one job ago, or just starts with the current role that they have. Like, we don't know what they were doing beforehand, and I think that's usually telling. I'm like, oh yeah, so people tend to highlight what they want to highlight, and I'm going to do the same thing. Like Tiffany said, and I think you alluded to earlier, Tamara, I mean, I started out in big law, hated it. I mean, it was a great experience. It just wasn't for me. I valued my personal time, this idea that you can bill all these hours and stuff. It just wasn't, I mean, for many people, that's for some. It just wasn't for me. I think when I came out of law school, people were always talking about the like 4 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep. And that's just crazy to me. I need my 8 hours, I need 8 plus right now with the little baby. And like, I'm not going to lose any of that, because that's how I can be productive in the day, and I can actually do what I need to do, and I can be the person I need to be for the clients I work with. So yeah, no, that whole idea that, oh, if you aren't doing X amount of this, or if you're not sleeping this little, then you're somehow not successful, is just a load of garbage. I did the whole thing where I transitioned to a role where I was like, oh, this is going to make me happier because it's in-house with a large corporation. And that wasn't the right move for me. I was chasing the wrong things. I was chasing titles and money as opposed to what I actually wanted to do with my life and where I wanted to live and be happy. I had this list of these things I wanted. And then I started to look at the list. After a while, I'm like, none of this stuff is actually making me happy. I was like, so I need a whole new list. What do I want? Like, what do I want in life? Oh, I would like to have a spouse, Oh, I would like to be in a role where I have a bit more ownership of my time, which means that I probably need to work for myself and not anybody else. That was kind of like the beginning of me being more entrepreneurial, when I realized like, I can't work for anybody else. I need to work for me. That would make me happy long term. And so over time, and now when I say time, I graduated law school in 2010. It is 2021 right now. So this was not a quick journey. This has been an arc of a decade of me kind of coming into my own in a sense of what I want out of this life, my life, not anybody else's. I mean, I care about the world for sure, but I care more about me and what I want out of it, right? I get one chance at this. And so I had to really sit down and think about, what do I want out of this at the end of the day? What's going to make me truly happy? And it's not going to be the job stuff, I promise you. I mean, the career should be fulfilling, but it cannot be the only thing that's fulfilling. And so for me, yeah, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of, oh, I hate this job, or I'm going to go to over here. I think the green is grasser. It's not, And so it had to be a real honest inventory of myself about what is it that I'm looking for, because I keep jumping around. I could keep jumping around and I'll be miserable. So this is not working. I need to pivot. My wife and I always talk about that. Pivot is important. Like when you recognize something is not working out, you got to pivot, because you might think that you have eternity, right? Because you're a law student or you're a young lawyer and your career looks like it's going to be this long arc. Time will go by fast, and the decisions that you make now will be really impactful in the long run. Especially if you have that honest inventory of yourself and you make that recognition that, hey, these are things I want in life. Here are the things that I need. And through that process, you gain grit, right? You gain an understanding of what your non-negotiables are in a way. So, yeah.
Pivot is a magical word and a magical concept once you embrace it, right? Dave, you really hit on a really important point, and I'd love for Natasha and Tiffany to weigh in here. So, we've illuminated to master the pivot, to take an inventory, to know all these things that matter, to find fulfillment outside of work. Where does someone start with that? What are some practical ways someone can sit down with themselves and take that inventory to have that introspection? Do either of you have some, any information you would share with the audience of maybe square one? How would someone even start with having that conversation? It might seem overwhelming to have that for the first time. I'll kick it to Natasha, to you first. What do you think here? Oh, and I think we have you on mute.
Right. I mentor a lot of young people, mostly psychologists, sometimes physicians, and a lot of times they ask me, so what the advice you would have given, yourself from, I'm about to retire, I'm full retirement age, when you were young. And usually I say to them, the most significant probably advice I would have given to myself when I was your age: be kinder to yourself, have more self-compassion. And a lot of times people ask me this question, but isn't it because you were like driven that you're so successful? And I said, yes, and so being driven is good, but what both Tiffany and David were talking about is finding your own story. Yeah, so we need role models. We need to read about the people. We like people who are like us, or who we want to be like, right? But then your story will be your story. You will never really repeat the hero's journey of the hero you thought was your hero, right? So you will arrive at the place. And my personal mantra is this: I'm doing the best that I can. And I can do better if I am kind and compassionate to myself. That's why for me, like for you guys, no 4-hour nights, no all-nighters, learning how to say no, how to, choose things, that requires self-compassion. So to me, the building block of resilience is self-compassion. Now, the studies have shown that between 70 and 80% of us are more compassionate to other people than ourselves. Why is that? What's wrong with the picture? Why double standard? Double standards never work. So then self-compassion is something that is teachable and trainable. It's an emotional and cognitive skill that we can develop. And David intuitively learned it somehow, but there is the whole field that is called positive psychology. This is the science of happiness and thriving. And there is core premise in positive psychology. In order to be happy, you need to be authentically self. You cannot be happy pretending to be anything other than you are. So being present for your feelings and not having the aversion to your feelings of fear. I always say fear is the only thing that gets smaller the closer you get to it, right? But we use fear avoidance a lot of times. So just having the time to even look into your heart. So the exercise that I do every morning when I wake up, it is called drop in, tune in, listen in. Drop into your body, see what's happening in your body. The quick body scan. Tune into your heart. What are the feelings that are showing up there? Sometimes anger, sometimes resentment, sometimes joy, sometimes, many at the same time. Just, make room for them. And then listen in. Listen in is what your brain is doing, how you interpret everything. Be present, and then I go and do my to-do lists and not to-do lists. When I am in the angry space, don't go on Facebook or Twitter. Do not. When I'm angry, do not text, do not email, do not talk to people until you figure out, until you are in the calm green space, I call it, when you can understand what's happening with you. So it's a lot of inner work, but it needs to be something that is kind of disciplined. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it needs to be a routine. And self-compassion is something that is just a practice. It's like a prayer that every morning when I wake up, may I be happy, may I be healthy, may I live with ease. And then you send loving kindness to people you love and then people who you hate. And this is a practice.
Wonderful. Tiffany, what are your thoughts here? What's the first step? How would you encourage people to start looking inward here?
I think the first step is also acknowledging that you're worth taking the time to do this work. A lot of times we say, I don't have time, I got to do this, I got to do this. Your own happiness, your own ability to build resilience and to build that grit is worth taking the time. So once you come to that, like, I am worth it, this is worth it, then taking that time to do exactly what Natasha talked about, acknowledging what you're feeling, going through, and it's okay that you are feeling this way. It's okay that you don't wake up every morning raring to go, doing cartwheels out the bed. Sometimes you have to acknowledge that I'm not okay today. And then, Dave talked a lot about what's important. When you get some sleep, I always like to do this when I'm well rested. But after that, really think about, what do I value? What's important? If this went away today, what would I miss? What could I not live without? And it really starts to put things in perspective for you. And when you have that list of what you value and what's important to you, then you're able to see other things through that different lens. That yes, this particular situation, I didn't do this well at work. It sucks. I am not going to act like it's a great feeling to not do what you want to do. It is going to be a horrible feeling. I often acknowledge those feelings when I have a mess up. I take the time to feel angry, to cry, to do all of that. But then when I take that time, I go back and I examine, because remember, failure has to be a lesson. So I go back to get those lessons and I sit there and I say, okay, in the grand scheme of my life, how important is this? And if then I'm able to say that. And then if it is important, I need to say, okay, now let me take accountability. What did I not do well that I can change later? And then what are the things that I just have to extend myself some grace and say, you know what, you did what you could do in this moment. Didn't turn out the way it should have turned, or you wanted it to turn out, but you have this lesson now that you can go for it. So take that time. You're worth that time. Take the time to figure out what's important, and then use that as your lens of how you're going to examine these other experiences in your life, even when there's failure.
I think that's such a great point, Tiffany. So many of us skip that step one, that we're worth the time. We give that time to so many other people freely, but never to ourselves. So such a fantastic point. We got a question from the audience, and instead of saving it for later, Dave, I want to kick it to you now because it fits so well here. And if you have more to expound, I should give that caveat. So the question is, in your pivot, what steps did you take when creating the list of what you wanted? Were there specific questions that you asked yourself or specific resources you relied upon? Any further insight you have there, Dave?
Yeah, it was in the same way that I think as lawyers and law students, essentially at the end of the day, we're problem solvers. I started to try to problem solve my own life. I started, instead of giving someone else advice, I started trying to get my own advice. And so I wanted to look at aspects of work that I enjoyed. And so Was it the subject matter? Was it the environment in which I worked in? Was it the type of hours I was having to do? Was it the colleagues? Like, there's so many aspects about a working environment where if I could splice out the things that I enjoyed and the things that I didn't enjoy, I could kind of carve out what I need to be in, right? And then look for those spaces and people that were doing those things. Maybe not all of them, but were, in the environment. And so for me, I made a list. I realized that I didn't want to work in a large environment with a lot of people. So that was a big like aha moment. So maybe the firm world was not for me. I realized further down the road that I valued my time and I wanted to control all of my time. So the only way you can really do that is if you work for yourself. And so I had to make steps over time to figure out how I was going to do that effectively. Also made a decision that at some point I didn't know if I necessarily wanted to practice in the traditional sense. I think, and I don't right now. I have a consulting group with 3 other partners, and so, and one's not even a lawyer, and so I had to, kind of come to grips with that I could use my legal skill set in a different manner, still very effective, right, and be, financially lucrative along the way. But I had to kind of figure that out. That maybe traditional path is not for me. So I kind of spliced out the things I enjoyed and things I did not enjoy. And I tried to figure out if I could find all the things I enjoyed, maybe 75, 80% of them, and try to pivot myself in that space over time. And so, yeah, that was kind of my approach. I took a role where I was in a rural part of the South when I'm from the DC area, and I took a job to work in academia for a college president, but it was in a rural part of North Carolina. And so that period of kind of not being near things gave me even more space and time to think about what I really wanted to do for my career, because I didn't have distractions of DC and happy hour and whatnot and all my friends and let's go here, let's go there, and let's do this. I just had the time to focus on me. And so when Tiffany was mentioning, like, you have to recognize that you are worth that time. For me, I couldn't do it on my own. I actually had to remove myself in a way to have the space to even think about that, to even have that kind of critical conversation about my own self, to get to where I wanted to be long term. And so, yeah, it was literally, to me, it's that critical thinking, the way that we problem solve for our clients about how to comply or do whatever within the law. I'd use that same mode of thinking just for myself. And so it was just a constant asking of questions about me. Like, what am I doing? What do I want? What do I want to be? What do I want to live? I live in Los Angeles now. I didn't even know that until like 4 years ago that I wanted to live in LA. I had to really think about, like, where could I be on this planet, right? That I would bring me the most joy. Even that simple question was an aha moment, because I thought that I was DC born and raised, going to die in Northwest. And no, I realized I kind of wanted to try something else over time. So yeah, that was my approach to it. I think, at the end of the day, you'll be in this position where if you're uncomfortable, I think most people think that you'll get advice from an older generation, I think, that will say, well, just power through. Well, my attitude is like, no, being uncomfortable for a long period of time is not normal. And I'm not going to do that. And so if I'm uncomfortable in the workplace, in my role, in my job, or any aspect of my personal life, I'm going to make a change of that, because I'm not going to continue to progress in this uncomfortable state, because that's not normal to me. It may have been normal for a previous generation, but not for me. And I'm not going to do that. So yeah, that's kind of how I handled it, how I made that pivot. But it was just a constant asking of questions of myself and realizing that, hey, this uncomfortable atmosphere that I'm in right now is not normal. And I'm going to make a change.
Awesome. Hopefully that empowers someone out there to equally make a change for the better. So we got a ton of questions pre-submitted when folks registered. Hopefully in our remaining 5-ish minutes, we might go about 5 over, we can get through a handful of these. So we'll do a little bit of a lightning round to everyone, and whoever wants to take them can. I'll tee it up to one of you, but feel free to jump right in like we're playing tennis. Just go for it if someone else has an answer too. So one of the questions that was submitted was, how do you recover when you make a mistake at work? And how do you recover, when that fear of that mistake being used against you is kind of looming, especially in the dynamic of the legal field. So Tiffany, I'm going to kick that to you first.
So, first, feel all your feelings, be upset, cry, kick walls, do all of that. Take the time to do that. And then you want to go back, learn that lesson, acknowledge what your role is, and be honest about that. When you're in the workplace, I think taking accountability for your role is important. And not, a lot of times, I have my friends I can vent to where I say, if they had done this and this and this, I wouldn't have done that, and then this wouldn't have happened. But when you're going for an apology or you're taking accountability, people really don't want to hear about that part of it. So stand in what you could have done differently, and then make the promise to yourself that you're going to do better in the future, that you're going to change from this situation, and that you're going to learn a lesson. What processes do I need? What do I need to do differently so that I don't make this mistake again? Now, you can't 100% sure say that people won't use your mistakes against you. Maybe they will. But a lot of times, if you're able to learn that lesson and say you're going to put it into place, it takes some of that power away when they bring that mistake up again.
Dave, you're our resident young lawyer. I'm specifically curious on if you've had experience with this or had this fear at all. What are your thoughts here?
Sorry, is that question to me?
Yes, sorry if I thought I said Dave, but I could have just imagined it.
Okay, repeat the whole question for me. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So I said you are a resident young lawyer. I'm curious if you have thoughts here, if you've had this fear or if you've lived this, fear into action, if you've, had the mistake looming over your head, if that dynamic has existed, and how you've overcome that and how you deal with that in a workplace scenario.
Oh yeah. I mean, oh gosh, those first few years in big law, I mean, I felt like when it was during the financial crisis, so I felt like every mistake meant I was going to get fired. And so it was just this extra looming, like kind of perfectionism thing going on that was very stressful. It wasn't stressful just for me, it's stressful for everybody, working in that type of environment. I think at the end of the day, I recognize that I did have a good partner that I worked with, and so she was more on the side of leaning to help me and advise me when I did make mistakes versus another partner that I worked with that just kind of blasted me for it. And that's the working dynamic, right? There are going to be some individuals that are going to be really supportive and some that are not. I think for me, for me at the time, I really internalized a lot of those mistakes, which is not what you should do. I felt like, oh, this speaks to my ability as an attorney or to where I went to law school, et cetera. Oh, they're going to judge me. That is so wrong. This doesn't speak to you as your ability as an attorney or where you're law school, whatever. All it means is you just made a mistake. That's it. And you know who makes mistakes? Everyone. Everyone on the planet makes mistakes. Like no one's perfect. And to the degree of the mistake, whatever. But to have that someone say grace, compassion for yourself, like, you know what, I did something wrong, I won't do it again, I'll learn from this. I got that lesson a little later on. In the beginning, I didn't have that. I was like, I don't know, like probably every other person freaking out, right? And that's not ideal, right? That's not good long term. And so my attitude now is like, oh yeah, I didn't do that, I'm sorry, I won't do that next time. Or you know what, that was, and for me, it's not so much mistakes in writing now, it's like communication and trying to make sure you're overly communicating to the client that you're working with. And like, I didn't mention that, I should have, yada yada, just owning it and moving on. At the end of the day, it's not that serious. No one's died is how I like to say it. Like, this is not the most dramatic thing that could happen, so we'll all be okay. Time goes on, and that's kind of like my attitude. The positive reinforcement, positive thinking that Natasha mentioned, like, hey, this could be far worse. So
perspective is definitely key. And the last question I have, perspective is huge, but it's very hard to have in this moment, and that's the bar exam. We all know the bar exam is a monster, and for some of us, it's a monster we have to face a couple times. So I'm curious, what tips do you have for folks that are preparing to study for the bar exam, or maybe preparing to study to sit for the bar exam a second or a third time? How should that relationship with fear or failure look? And what encouragement do you have for folks to maybe reframe that relationship? And Natasha, I'll turn to you first for that answer.
Well, I do work with attorneys who failed the bar exam, and a lot of times they're referred to me because it's a very hard failure. Because, usually people who become attorneys are very successful and they're used to the story of academic success. So, one of the things I do is I hook them up to biofeedback to show to them that they are in trauma space. Because what happens, when you have the experience of, it is sometimes ambiguous failure, right? We think we failed, but we, didn't. It's not ambiguous. Someone thought you were not, enough to practice law, right? It's very ego threatening. A lot of times there are also ramifications for your family, because you have to take the time. So there are many things that happen. So I hook up people to the biofeedback and show to them how traumatic it is for them. So one of the things I explain to them, it is traumatic, but trauma is not what happens to you, it what happens inside of you. So a lot of times the damaging effects of trauma is developing self-limiting, self-defeating beliefs. And the most taxing one is I'm not enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not this enough. So one of the things that we do in therapy is we change mindset. I call it mindset reset. We have the reset button, and I will provide slides with the reset, because I have, of course, an acronym for reset, how to change your mind. But, life is the personal transformation journey. So it's one of many failures that people have. And if fear avoidance sets in as your strategy, then, the saying, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So in therapy, there is the notion of what is called post-traumatic growth, right? You can experience post-traumatic growth. And both Tiffany and Dave talked about how, when we ask lessons learned, what have I learned about myself? So this is one of the ways that we can change. Like post-traumatic growth is about not having the self-limiting beliefs. But then there is also the way of just regulating your nervous system by doing things that are breathing and tapping and all kinds of things, but mostly self-compassion. So, it is traumatic. And the way out of it is practicing self-compassion, being present, watching out for three things. So you need to change your mindset. You need to be motivated, because a lot of times people go into procrastination and they don't study. So motivation is a big piece. And when you are exhausted, when you beat yourself up because you cannot sleep, you won't have motivation. So working with energizing yourself. And then you have to have good methods, because what schools don't teach us a lot of times, they don't teach us how to learn. A lot of things that we learn in school are not really helpful for really learning. So you have to have good methods. I teach my clients how to be good learners.
Awesome. And as we wrap, Dave, any final thoughts you'd like to share on that question with reframing concepts of fear with the bar exam?
Yeah, I'll say I sat for a bar in North Carolina in 2010, and then I took a 2020 bar in California. And so each time I was just as nervous about the exam, even though there's a 10-year gap in between them. I passed both times, but doesn't dismiss the fact that I still had a little anxiety about the experience. And I think what I realized the second go around is that it's very mental. This is not an intelligent exercise. They're not testing my ability of my smarts. This is just an aptitude test. And there are a lot of idiots already out here that are lawyers that pass the bar exam. And so I have to remind myself that I was like, look, there's a lot of people out here that have done this, that if I have to do this, I just need to focus on what the bar is asking me for, and realize that this is all in my head. It has nothing to do with my ability to be an attorney or advise clients or my intellect. Like it's just all mental. So Natasha he was right on the head about like what the damage that will happen if you are not successful the first go around is going to be mental, because it will be that self-doubt, that oh, I didn't do this, or I'm not good enough. Like that is all garbage, because I promise you, you are, if you went through law school, you are good enough, period. So now it's just, of this hurdle, right? Of this silly exam that you won't even remember when it's like over. So yeah, dismiss the fact that there's anxiety, which so I wanted to share, like I had anxiety, I still did, even 10 years in the game, I still had anxiety the second go around. But it's very much a mental exercise with a bar, and I would say almost like a mental resilience and strength exercise as well, because the exam is so long. And so the bar is just trying to make sure that you can, if you can do this, then of course you can be an attorney. So yeah, I think yeah, just don't get stuck in your head about the exam. Do what you can, do what you know that is do put the time in, right? Like the point about procrastination, I mean, it's real. I've had friends that procrastinated and they didn't pass. I mean, they didn't put the time in. And so there's no shortcut to passing the bar. You will have to put in that time, but recognizing that it is very much a passable exam. People pass it all the time, and you will too.
Awesome. Great encouragement there. And as we close out our program, I'm going to give a super lightning round, a couple word answer. Tiffany, you mentioned that failure is a lesson, and I loved that. So I'm going to steal that from you. As we close out here, if you could, each of you just go around and what is your biggest lesson learned? How have you grown through failure? If you could just give us your quick answer. Lessons learned. So Natasha, if you want to share anything that you've learned as you've gone through this journey in life and what failure has given you to go forth and continue to prosper.
Well, for me, failure is ambiguous. So what I always say, the only failure that is a real failure is the failure to thrive. And failure to thrive is the medical term for babies who don't thrive. What I mean, like the failure to be content and happy and be yourself. And this is something that is hard, but that's what I really consider failure. I testified in court. It was a very difficult. I was on the stand for 2 days. It was the death penalty case in the habeas evidentiary hearing. And it took 6 months for the decision to come down. When I came back, I was in a fetal position for 3 days. I thought I did horribly, and they killed Mr. Robert Lewis, who was a Black man with intellectual disability. I thought that I was horrible. Well, when the decision was delivered 6 months later, basically it was the favorable decision. So he lives. But, sometimes we are so hard on ourselves that, the failure sometimes is ambiguous, but now it is my post-traumatic growth story. Now I have to testify again, and in, the proceedings, evidentiary hearing in a couple of months. And, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Now I know how to be on the stand for 2 days and be okay.
Awesome. Dave, how about you?
For me, I turn my verbiage around. I say that I'm not failing at anything. I've had some disappointments along the way, and I've had some things that did not go my way, but I am not a failure. I am thriving, and that my best days are ahead of me, not behind me. And so I'm looking forward to the future, and I'm trying to create this happy life for myself. So that's how I think you should probably view and frame your mindset going forward.
I love it. And Tiffany, you are our anchor to start, and so you are going to be our anchor to close. How about you?
An author of the book called A Professional Troublemaker says, everyone who's going to make a big impact in life is going to make mistakes. And so the biggest lesson that I have learned is I am my own biggest self-critic. I'm harder on myself than anyone else. But when I remember that everyone is making mistakes, it allows me to show myself the grace and the compassion to learn and get better each and every day. And so I love the conversation about growing after the mistakes. And that's what I want to leave you with, is that every time we have a mistake, there's a lesson. And then there's an opportunity for growth. And if we look for that and find it, we will thrive.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all for being here with us today. Your perspective has been fantastic. Your encouragement and empowerment has just been amazing. I want to thank our attendees for tuning in, for hanging with us. We went a few minutes over, but it's hard to cut good conversation short. As we close, I want to leave you with a really cool quote I found. And that quote is, "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. In fact, it may be necessary to encounter encountered the defeats so you can know who you are, what you can rise from, how you can still come out of it. So I hope you enjoyed today's program, and hopefully this has empowered you to find what your lesson is and to find your path forward. Thank you so much. Have a good one.